That make the same shape. So we must push one common intention. It's for a better life in the region. For we woman and we children. That must be the ambition of the Caribbean and the Caribbean and the Caribbean.
Hello and welcome to our weekly podcast. We continue this week with our series on oil and gas with Professor Clive Thomas. Of course, that issue continues to dominate the discussions, and it must be that way because oil, the coming of oil, and the elevation of our country to a petro state has implications for all aspects of our society. So we continue that discussion on the future of the oil and gas industry. Of course, the new oil blocks and the auction that the government had promised, we have not seen them yet. We'll talk to Professor Clive Thomas today about that issue and see where we go. Professor Clive Thomas, good evening.
Good evening, David.
And welcome to this week's edition of Guyana's Oil with us. We want to talk today about going forward. A lot of commentary on what happened in the past, and we have addressed some of that, the contract and what should have been done and so forth. Today we want to look forward. The government did promise that there would be an auction for the new oil blocks. We haven't seen that materialize yet, but we want to start our discussion today with you explaining to us what an auction for the blocks would look like and whether you think that is a forward-looking approach.
Yes, I can do some of that here today, David. The first thing that you have to recall is that the negotiations for the oil blocks originally occurred through bilateral negotiations with the companies directly and the government of Guyana. And they called that in the auction terms, duty contest, because the various firms will be contesting with each other to see who had the best to offer and what they had and were offering. People consider that type of auction system not being transparent and open to a lot of corruption. So the general tendency is to move towards auctions. But auctions, while they may appear to be a solution, themselves create problems. And I don't know if the government is au fait with all of them, or they might be stumbling on some of them, because originally they should have started the auctions sometime early this year. They announced it in December of last year. So by mid-April, we should have had the auctions already. But they were announced earlier this week that they postponed the auctions that were due in mid-July, maybe going forward at least another month. So they're obviously having difficulties with the auctions. And the difficulties can come from two sources. One is that the regulatory framework needs to be improved. And they probably want to finish that before they set about doing the auctions. And the second thing is that they need to get the information out about the auctions. And they've been trying to do some of that. For example, some of the seismic data that they get from the ExxonMobil, people who are working along with their associates, Hess and CNOP. They've been able to get some of that data and they offer it to persons who submit bids. But auctions are fairly complex operations, although they may appear quite simple. And right now, I've completed a couple of articles which will appear sometime later in this month about the impact of the auctions practice on results. A lot of that depends on what you aim the auctions to try to do. The government has not been clear what the objective behind the auction is. So I have tried to set up an evaluation mechanism in the articles I've been writing for July next month, in which I look at the resource price. That is how it affects government take, the average effective tax rate, and to see whether that will be approved. So we aim to see if the auctions will lead to increased revenue. And some countries set that goal. Revenue maximization is the primary goal for going to the auctions, not relying on the negotiations. But there's also investment. You might want to set up a target or a goal of trying to maximize investment flows in the sector. And with a limited shelf life for oil, given the transition to renewables, we might want to place more emphasis on that so we could get the exploitation of the oil and the oil out of the ground as rapidly as possible to maximize the possibilities of getting our people out of poverty within the limited time frame where oil is still a viable option given the carbon emitting nature of the fuel. So those considerations have to be taken into account. So whether you go for revenue maximization, whether you go for maximum investment, whether you go for the quantity of output, you want to increase the rate of output faster than it is. All these things have to be considered. And I thought originally they were just reacting to the general criticism that somebody picked up in the social or print media, talking about how auctions are better than they haven't evaluated it. But there are two pretty good studies, I think, on auctions, which I'm going to consider separately in two separate articles. One is more theoretical studies done by an American professor called Crampton, and he has tried to evaluate the auction of mineral rights and the ways in which countries should try to go with that, particularly developing countries who are emerging as petro states or have emerging oil sectors. The other one was done by two Indian scholars in India, and they well published in Oxford, but they are originally from India, and they evaluated the Indian practice with all auctions because they've been doing it since the 20th century. So they study covered the period, I think, from the late 1990s right up to 2010, to the middle of the 2010s. And their study also gave valuable information. And most of the data show that it is not a clear-cut advantage of auctions. It is not necessarily a guarantee that you're going to do better through auctions. And for a number of reasons, most of them have to do with how you set the goals, how you set up the nature of the auction that you're offering. And these auctions have to be targeted to what you want to do with them. Whether you want to maximize revenue or what you want to maximize investment. So I think the government is probably stumbling into all those difficulties now as they proceed. So the original date of early 2023 is now shifted. And only this week, I think there's an announcement given by one of the ministers, I don't know if the Minister of Natural Resources, that the auctions will be shifted for going forward for the period.
Yeah, you speculated that one of the difficulties they might have had is not robust enough regulations. Expand on that a little.
Well, countries like Guyana are always beset by the problem that because they're coming into the sector only now, there's a lot of regulatory difficulties. You remember we had Mark Bino, who was the person acting as representing the government's interest in the regulation.
Right.
He is gone, so there's been a turnover of staff. There's no continuity. Vincent Adams, who was there giving guidance on environmental and other matters, he is gone because the government lost the election. They didn't keep him on. So with a turnover of staff and within short period of time over which the oil sector has been actually thriving and going very fast. There's not been enough attention paid to the I shouldn't say attention, enough guarantees that the attention that we pay to the reform of the regulatory framework is paying dividends. So the government remains uncertain of that. And I think they want to make sure that it's strengthened. Because you lose if you don't have a good regulatory framework. As we can see with the case that we have now, dealing with the environmental guarantees that the parent company should give for all its bills. Your environmental framework has got to be solid. It's got to be clear laws, clear mandates, and clear expectations from those persons who are supposed to be running those institutions. And they have to meet standards that are set by the nation. And these standards have to be met in terms of best practice. And therefore, they're not optional standards because there's so much scrutiny on oil as a source of energy.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. One of the things I'm interested in, and I think our audience would be interested in, there are 14 blocks to be auctioned.
Yeah.
How do they determine a block, and what's the mechanism used?
The government has decided the block to be between 1 and 3,000 square feet meters. A lot of it has to do with the way in which you expect the reservoirs to be located under the sea. Because remember, we're doing deep sea mining as well as shallow water mining. So we have to estimate what the size of the catchment area is for the reservoir or the particular well. And that is what governs the size of the block.
And so with
largely not what a geologic problem.
Right. So with 14 blocks part of the regulation, because the minister did say in his announcement this past week that they're working on the regulatory measures, and you alluded to that. Can the government decide whether a company, whether they can limit the number of blocks a company can own?
They have limited it. That's I shouldn't say that because the auction has not been held, but I'm pretty certain they're going to do that.
Yeah. And of course, we know that part of the limiting has to avoid monopoly. Are there any other reasons that?
Yes, the other reason is to give nationals a chance.
Good, wonderful.
Remember, originally we had lots of difficulties with the allocation of the blocks. And in fact, that was one of the matters that Sarah was investigating pretty comprehensively until they disbanded Sarah.
Right,
so
right.
Nobody's pursued any towards the inquiry of me as to what has been taking place. So I gather that investigation has been abandoned.
Let me read. So go ahead, CY.
So there's a lot of dissatisfaction. There's some Guyanese who feel that they've been cut out of the deals. They feel a lot of political patronage existed before, and that governed the dispensation of the licenses. Some people took the licenses and sold them. So they used their preferred access, political access, to gain money for themselves rather than for the country's benefit. So all those things are will probably not ever get resolved anymore. But the American government, strange enough, was interested in also trying to tidy up this sector. And the initiatives that they were trying to take never came to fruition because the whole thing was abandoned.
And
I've never heard a word.
Right. Let me read a little here from what the minister said and get your comments on it. He said, and I quote, industry feedback on the advanced pace of modernizing the oil and gas regulatory framework, yes, underscores the extended bidding period for the nation's first competitive offshore oil and gas licensing round. The round, officially launched on December 9, 2022, continues to receive strong global interest, and the government has benefited from insightful feedback during the consultation period of the indicative terms and guidelines and the draft model production sharing agreements. Anything there that
that's the standard practice, what has been happening. And that is what I've also written on in the articles. And those are two standard and usual reasons for this happening. One is the government was not prepared with all the regulations and the institutions they need to have ready. And secondly, they're hoping to, by talking to the potential investors, to get some idea of what they expect or what they want. Because you can't just set up an auction in abstract. You have to have some idea what is going to guide investors and their motivations. So I think they've been trying to get some informal feedback on that. And that is why we referred to the two obstacles earlier that they've found and why they had to postpone it. One is they need to get more feedback from the potential investors. Because there's no sense having an auction and nobody bids.
Right.
Situation, so you might as well talk to them before. So the difference between an auction and a negotiation by way of a beauty contest is not totally 100% different. It has some elements of both. You have to find out from the company what they're looking for and try to tailor it to the interest. The other thing is that the government might feel that they need to guide some investors or some countries or groups of investors to Guyana to invest. And they may want to set up special arrangements to incentivize them. I mean, if I were running the auctions, I wouldn't treat it as if that was the only thing I'm relying on. Because to rely on an abstract market competitive process like an auction is, I think, total madness. You have to coordinate it with knowledge and insight and negotiations and understandings. I would try to find more sympathetic investors, people more interested in developing the country, developing the South, rather than some fly-by-night organization that may have capital, but only interested in ripping you off.
Right. How is this? Can this auction be used as a way of improving on the much maligned contract?
But that's the whole purpose of the auction.
Okay.
So they've already set out terms in which they will reform the contract. Those are already indicative terms have already been set. For example, they raise the royalty rate from 2% to 10%. They're demanding some company taxes. The countries will have to pay 10% and things like that. In fact, when I did the calculations, and when they do it too as well, the increase in the average effective tax rate is significant. It moves from where it is now, I think nearly doubles. But that in itself, it sounds good. But remember, once you raise the price, unless the demand is totally inelastic, demand will fall. Because people can't afford to pay that, will not pay the higher price for what you have. So we have to balance a trade-off between trying to get more revenue against getting more investment.
Right.
And that problem doesn't disappear. It remains even if we have a beauty contest.
Because
that is what the government fails to recognize.
Yeah. So you're saying that if they, for example,
it's like everybody demanded to take more.
And
And if they try to take more, you have to recognize the law of all markets wherever they exist in the world. Is unless people are insensitive, totally insensitive to price. Once you raise price, the demand for the product will fall.
So let me put you on the spot here, Professor. If you were in charge of the auctions, how would you strike the balance between trying to get as much as you can for your country, but trying to woo investors? Because I think that's what you're saying. Because if you demand too much, investors may not come. And if you demand too little, you find yourself back to where you were. Right. So if you were in charge of the auction, what are the factors you would take into consideration as you try to balance those two things?
The first and most important factor you need to take into consideration is, can I substitute for the investors myself? Mm-hmm. Do I have the capacity? And in every case that I could think of, it is no. So you know that we don't have the capacity. It takes several $1 billion to run one well. We don't have the capacity to run 14 wells. Even if you take every cent out of every bank, out of every person's pocket in Guyana, you can't even run one well. So you have to start with the recognition that if we're going to deal with this problem, we have to be able to develop Guyana to a stage where the demand from indigenous sources represents a real competition from external sources. But we don't have that capital. The few people who are trying to struggle to get part of the oil sector, who are Guyanese, are struggling in the periphery. You probably know some of them. They've been on for years and years, even before Exxon.
Right.
We just don't have the capital to do it. So we have to balance the need to get invested. And in doing that, we also have to look at the source of investment, because it may be for different reasons. Some countries that might be more collaborative or supportive, like if I were dealing with a Caribbean person, for example, as an investor, I would treat that person more liberally or generously than it would somebody from any other part of the world. So we have to look to see where we can find similar opportunities for synergies so that we develop the oil with the recognition that we have to ensure that we have a real competition with the traditional barons. Then we don't, and then we have to play them off one against the other.
Yes.
I mean, yes, instead of taking Exxon and Monolith, I would have dealt with each one of them, Hess, CNOOC, and Exxon differently, independently, and create relations with them to generate the competitive juices among them, because they're all entrepreneurs. And to be able to do that, you need to have a stake in the company's operations and the company floor. And that is why I said in Guyana, the first thing you need is to set up a national oil company, which takes out shares in Exxon and its co-venturers and becomes part of the boardroom in which decisions are made. But you can then play the Guyana option for yourself. It just needs strategic and other thinking, but the danger that exists knowing the criminal state is that people may do that and see opportunities to enrich themselves. Yes. Because once you get into that boardroom, you can make money for yourself as well as make for the country. So you have to have people with high standards of morality and that type of thing to make sure they don't fall into the bribery.
So I hear you saying
the management of human beings is the problem, political problem.
Yeah. So when we're thinking about mechanisms, we have to think about mechanisms that include the possibilities for the requisite skills that are needed. But you're saying that we need to twin that also with if I may layman terms, anti-corruption,
deviant behavior.
Yes,
You
yes,
have to,
yes.
you have to pay close attention to defense behavior because this is a situation rife for people to exploit and make money off of for themselves. And I'm pretty sure some of them are doing it. Corruption hasn't stopped because we stopped talking about it. If anything, it's probably getting more intense
Yes, yes,
because
yes, yes.
the gains are much more than they were before. There's a lot more at stake.
Uh-huh. And when Sarah was in existence, would you say that it served as a kind of deterrence?
I don't think it's served as a deterrent. No, not quite, but it's building up capacity though.
Mhm, mhm.
And, what was important, I think, is for it to get international connection because most of these things operate at the global level. You need to have a high investment by the authorities, the government themselves, in wanting to promote it as a means of getting monies for the country. I've seen that a lot of leakage take place that way. And that you have to make sure that the classes that are there waiting to siphon off the goodies for themselves are not substituting themselves for the poor. That is why I have always supported the proposal that we have to make sure we have to guarantee that poor people get some direct benefit out of this. And it can't be done by government giving handouts. It has to be legislated in law, become part of the social code of Ghana, the economic code, part of the constitution or whatever it is, but it has to become a right on an entitlement of people, else we will end up with the resource course. We'll end up by the end of this period, the next 20, 30 years, with no guarantee that we have eradicated poverty from here.
The Stabroek block, that's the largest block that we have, right?
Yeah. Because the intent to reduce the operations of the other blocks. We talked about the reduced life, yeah.
Right. From the numbers that you are looking at, do you think that we can look at like the Stabroek block? I noticed a report in the Kaito News earlier this week that the Stabroek block raked in about I think $9 billion they were saying, but a lot of it went out in costs.
That's today's papers. They say
yes. I'm
$9
trying.
billion.
Yes.
Got
Any
your revenue
comments?
and every cost.
Yes. Any comments on that?
Well, I don't know the actual figures that they are quoting. I don't know the source. But the general comment is that it makes the point I've been trying to make since last week. That is the cost of producing the oil. It's not manna from heaven, it's a real cost. So indirectly, they recognize that by saying that you have to pay to get the oil, and it's not just revenue appearing. And you have to always account for that whenever you talk about whatever Guyana gets. And we can't substitute the cost because I was telling you, we don't have the money or the capital or the technology to be able to generate the output that is being undertaken, even in that one well. Or those 4 wells, they're probably talking about 3 wells, I think, that are fully operational now.
Right. And so of course that reduces your leverage, no?
Of course, because who will come into it?
Right. Yes, they're saying that the Stabroek block raked in $9.8 billion last year, but Exxon deducted $7.4 billion in costs. And of course, you've been making the point that it's standard in any business operation that costs have to be taken into consideration.
If you don't have a business, the thing doesn't
Right.
come from manna. It's not manna from heaven. To produce oil, you got to pay money to it. You have to have equipment, you got to have workers, you have to have all that. So you only fooling the public by making it sound as if the cost you're paying out is not something that you have to pay out to get the oil.
So you're saying
those costs in the face of it are high.
yes.
I can say that for a fact, and I think it's those are stated costs. And that's why we have auditors and all that to go through. Because the cost is broken down by the various studies I've seen. It do not rise to 7/9 of the value of the oil that we get.
Yeah,
it's more like 20 to 40%.
Right, because the 7/9 is about 80-something%.
Yeah.
That's pretty high.
Nearly 9.872 is nearly, it's 7-point-something%.
Yeah.
7.7% actually.
Right. And that's pretty high. But you're saying that the auditors can catch if there is
that's the whole purpose of them.
Yeah.
To make sure the costs are not inflated.
We're talking with Professor Clive Thomas here on the upcoming auctions and general issues surrounding the oil and gas industry. And as we've been saying throughout the series, that we intend to bring another eye to what's going on and another perspective. Professor, as you peruse the last 3 years, well, since this government has been in office, are you encouraged by its general management of the industry?
I would say on balance, if I had to rate it as management, I would give it a C. That's barely passing. That includes both governments.
Both governments.
Because the other one was there for a long time too.
Right.
But what is clear, and that is why I had produced those figures after the budget, and the micro macroeconomics of oil, is that the growth of the sector has been tremendous, spectacular. And there's no mistake when people say that we were the fastest growing economy in terms of the national accounts. Because everybody uses in the world the same national accounts.
Yes.
And that is what complicates the picture, because if you don't want to give any pats on your back for what the country has achieved, then you're not going to handle how it's going to go forward.
Yeah.
And to continuously see it as backward and portray it as a ignorant is to ignore the potentialities that we have within our class.
Grading is of course something that you've done all of your professional life.
That's why I gave it a C.
That's right. Now, what would you say is the most glaring weakness, or what are the most glaring weaknesses? How can they raise the C to, let's say, a B, at least a B?
A lot of it has to do with management of human resources, the politics of it. Many people who feel like we don't have no part to play in this economy. So to begin with, there's a waste, because these resources are limited and they're very scarce. So the country does not capture all the talents. So it starts out as a disadvantage. Starts out with big leakages of talent from the country, both by migration and by exclusion for political purposes. So that's where we got to start. We've got to be able to make sure we use our talents. And I feel that a lot of the weaknesses of the state are the machinery of delivering goods and services in the country stem from that same weakness. Nobody has a vision. You're not encouraging them, no mandate. You're giving a preference always to those who are closest to the political center. And if that is going to be your touchstone for progress and rewards within the structure, then I think it's going to be weakened by the political weaknesses of the division of people into separate groups.
Yeah, yeah. In that regard, let me draw you out on this. At one point, I think about 2 years ago, there was a flurry of experts coming from Trinidad and Tobago and advising the government, making a lot of commentaries on how Guyana can move forward with the industry. And I know, because I come up during the time when people like yourself and Trevor Farrell and so on were analyzing the oil and gas economy in Trinidad and Tobago. What would you say are the big lessons that we can learn from the Trinidad and Tobago experience?
Trinidad and Tobago experience has not been, in my mind, even a C, because they had a longer period over it. So
Yeah,
they had come out with some kudos for their administration of the external initiative, EITI, Transparency Initiative. It gotten some kudos with that. But generally, their oil and gas sector was weak. It didn't have anything compared to the capacity of ours.
right.
I think I mentioned that in one of these programs already.
Yes, at the very
They
beginning.
talk about 9,000 barrels, which we probably produce an hour.
Yeah.
So really no comparison. It was a trivial industry. Same as Suriname, because they invited me to their launch of the Statsoli oil company, producing oil going way back in the 80s. And that was just producing a couple of hundred barrels of oil a day. It was a lot at the time. But I said, not even at the time. It was considered important for the Suriname. They turned out with a lot of numbers. And they felt very proud at what they'd achieved because they'd done it all with local things.
Right.
But I think that has helped to create a feeling among them that they don't need a foreign capital. As a result, although most of this oil is supposed to be located off the Guyana-Suriname, in the Guyana-Suriname basin, there's not a single company that started to produce oil in Suriname yet, beyond this Statsoli.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So it shows that when you start with a high price, you pay the price.
You pay the price. You pay the price. See, why? Let me as we close out, let me ask you this general question. I mean, you've been critical of some of the conversations that have been going on in the public media about the industry and so forth. And since we've started this series, some commentators have latched on to some of the comments you have made. So, for example, in trying to balance that discussion that you have been, I think, mildly critical of, there are some quarters who are then using your comment to justify some of their narrative on the other side. How do you
Well, that is life.
Yeah.
Say life, here's the fancy. That's what you expect. That will happen. But the thing is that we have to be careful. And it is noticeable to me, maybe because I look at too much of American television, MSNBC.
Mhm.
I am struck by the power of misinformation.
Yeah.
I'm really alarmed and struck by it. People believe, I've seen people being interviewed on events in the States. And it's not, I don't want to discard ignorance, but they're blind unawareness of what is actually going on. It's frightening. I heard one guy started out by asking if asking if somebody's a rally for Trump. if he or she had worked to them, a couple standing up, believe in locking up your opponents. And they stand up by saying, no, that's wrong, it's treason, it's treason. So Biden should be locking up Trump. But then the guy turned to him and said, I was really talking about when Trump said he's going to lock up Biden.
Mhm.
And they said, no, you make a mistake. He never said that.
Yeah. I'm talking about misinformation. As we wrap up, we just concluded the local government elections. The results have not yet formally been announced by GCOM, but we have a sense of the results. What from your standpoint as a political economist, what are the lessons we can learn from these elections that were just so? Because clearly they were not ordinary local government elections.
They do. I think a number of lessons, and the first and probably most important, is that the electoral system still needs to be reformed. I still think the basic structural nature of the electoral mechanism remains flawed.
Mm-hmm.
And until we address that, participating in election, to my mind, is almost fruitless. And we need to find a means of putting pressure on getting that done. The second thing is I think that there's no doubt that racial sentiment exists pretty strongly in the country, and that constituencies have consolidated around primarily race. But the leadership is not willing to take any steps to dilute that. I think the basic opposition, for example, to the Buxton proposal stems from the feeling that the authorities that we have now feel that they want to give out the money. Not that they don't want money to be given. They want to give it out to bypass the date. So anything enshrined in the law, run as a public service, runs an entitlement by law and constitution, they ain't comfortable with it all.
Mm-hmm.
Unless it's a ministerial discretion, they're not happy. What I discovered for the short time I was in public service is almost every law that we have governing any institution we have always has a clause for the minister to override or make decisions contrary to what the organization itself is set up to do. Always subject to ministerial discretion. And I think that is overplayed. There are very few institutions that can be run by the institutional managers and operators. You always have to have fealty given out by the minister to whatever they're trying to do. And that is asking too much. And a young public service.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Yes. And of course, we had the instance, something that you alluded to in the very first program, and I think the vice president, it was at a press conference earlier this year, and the vice president latched on to it. And that was even before the elections. The whole question of using the revenues to as patronage and the buying of votes and so forth. Someone who's been around for a long time, how does that go down with you?
That goes down very badly with me. There's one of the most revolting things I can imagine that. And it always pains me greatly when I see some constituents just fawning and doing anything to get a little bit of groceries or some favor, even for a big favor, even with a plot of land. It is really embarrassing because these are things that people will get as citizens, as human beings.
Yeah.
But to be have them in a so vile manner, I find it personally repugnant. the one thing that I can't stand.
Mm-hmm.
And I find it happening too often when I look at the government programs, because they have television programs where they seem always to be advertising what they're giving out and what they're doing.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Putting everybody in sore while,
Right.
clapping and waiting on them to come and that is embarrassing.
Right. I will ask you one last question because I know you're a regional person. I was on a program earlier today in the Eastern Caribbean in Antigua, and we were discussing a kind of tour that the head of the central bank, the Eastern Caribbean Central Bank, making and meeting with stakeholders and so forth. And I, including the political opposition. I don't know if you have picked up that news item, but even if you haven't picked it up, is there any comment? Do you think that's it's something that's laudable?
I have had a fairly close relationship with the ECCB.
Good.
Because the governor was my student. I attended the opening.
Okay.
I maintained some sort of contact with the institution over the years, advising them in terms of staff recruitment and things like that. So I have a relationship with them.
Mm-hmm.
But much more civilized out in the islands, less.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Less, I would say, ungraciousness.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because I remember when Dwight Venner, was he was there for a very long time, and I always found that he brought a different kind of approach to central banking, and it's good to see that this youngster that is there, that is in charge, is moving out. And recognizing. Yes.
You just turned the mind right.
Good. So some things have rubbed off.
I'm your good friends too.
Okay. All right, Professor Clive Thomas, thank you very much. I think we, as usual, have been able to get some stuff out of you, and I'm going to see you next week when we continue our series of Guyana oil and gas. But of course, as we have done today, we look at attendant issues, issues that are connected directly and indirectly to oil and gas. Thank you very much.
Yeah, don't mention it, David.
Professor Clive Thomas. And, in these days when archiving has become so important, I think students are going to find the series like this very important. Already, a professor in Australia contacted me a couple of days ago and, said he was going through the formality of informing me that he is going to use some of this series that we're doing in his class this fall. And of course, for somebody like myself, I'm heartened by that, but I'm more heartened that somebody like Professor Thomas, who I think has a lot to contribute to our oil and gas industry. And it's a crying shame that both the past government and this one have not reached out to somebody like that. But here is a professor from Australia who finds what he's saying very important for his economic classes. Professor Rex Nettleford, in an interview I once did with him, he said, we have not built big towers and bridges. What we in the Caribbean have given to the world is our minds. And when you, of course, take the time and you listen to somebody like Clive Thomas, he proves what Nettleford has been saying, the creative intellect and the creative imagination, as Nettleford puts it. Thank you all for tuning in to yet another edition of the Open Word podcast and our series, Guyana's Oil, with Professor Clive Thomas. It's my pleasure, of course, always to be doing this. I think it's a very important aspect of both scholarship and activism. The role of ideas in activism and the role of public scholarship in scholarship. See you all next week.
One race from the same place that make the same trip on the same ship. So we must push one common intention. It's for a better life in the region for the woman